Thank you very much, Honorable Kushal Lubin.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on this very important motion put by the Leader of the Opposition. I will not take much of the time of the August Assembly because my learned friends, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, Honourable Utim and Honourable Umia from this side of the House have amply provided valuable arguments as to why this motion should be considered. However, I will be very legalistic in my approach during my intervention. My arguments are as follows, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir. The scenario that unfolds when the motion was laid on the 3rd of November 2020 has taken a twist when Business Mauritius and other parties have, on the 5th of November 2020, took the decision to knock at the door of the Supreme Court in order to seek, firstly, leave to apply for judicial review, and the following remedies are being sought, namely, a declaration that the Contribution Sociale Généralisée Regulations 2020, published under Government Notice number 214 of 2020, are unlawful, Wednesbury unreasonable, and that same were adopted in breach of the legitimate expectations of many stakeholders and the population at large. They are also seeking an order of certiorari of the decision of the Honourable Minister of Finance, Economic Planning and Development to adopt the CSG regulations. And secondly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, there is also pending before the Supreme Court an application for a constitutional redress challenging the amendment of the National Pensions Act brought by the Finance Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2020, including the introduction of a new Part 5A establishing the Contribution Sociale Généralisée. What are those constitutional redress all about, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir? The constitutional redress being sought and Section 1 of the Constitution, which enshrines the principles of a sovereign and democratic state, Section 2, which qualifies the supremacy of our Constitution, Section 3, which provides for the principle of prohibition of discrimination and of equality before the law, Section 8 of the Constitution, which affords protection against the deprivation of property, and Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, Section 45, subsection 1, which empowers Parliament to make laws for the peace, order, and good government of Mauritius, are being evoked, and it is now up to the Supreme Court and eventually maybe an interpretation of the law lords of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, if it goes to that instance, shall be the protagonist to rule, determine, and give a finality to the debates surrounding the applicability of the CSG regulations. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, it is worth pointing out that serious issues of discrimination are on the table with these regulations in place. The abolition of the NPF contributions and the introduction of the CSG will fundamentally affect many citizens of this country. The universal basic retirement pension payable from the age 60 will remain unchanged, but henceforth all increases to our elderly will be paid through a completely new mechanism, that is the CSG. And as from July 2023, as rightly pointed out by the Honourable Leader of the Opposition and Honourable Tim, the CSG benefit, yet to be prescribed, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, but announced publicly by the Honourable Minister at 4,500 rupees, will be paid as a top-up to the basic retirement pension as from the age of 65. Unlike the NPF, the CSG benefits will be paid irrespective of the individual's contributions and will even be paid to those who have never been employed and in respect of whom no contribution has ever been made to the CSG, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir. For example, employees of the private sector, notwithstanding their years of service, are being placed on the same level as other pensioners who have not contributed to the CSG, whilst the whole NPF scheme was intended to provide additional pension rights to those employees based on contributions made by or for them. Insured persons of the NPF will lose the opportunity to secure further contributory retirement benefits. By contrast, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, employees of the public sector who are not contributing towards the CSG from their remuneration and whose contribution is being unfairly subsidized by taxpayers of this country will perceive benefits under the CSG in addition to the benefits payable under the statutory schemes. It is, in my humble opinion, clear that the introduction of the CSG as a replacement of the NPF is discriminatory and will have catastrophic impacts on our economy. It is also unfair, unsustainable, and economically not feasible at all, and goes against the principles of equality and proportionality as enshrined in our Constitution. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I shall take my example. As a barrister, under the regulations, I'm classified as a self-employed, and the rates of CSG applicable to me shall be a mere 150 rupees per month. However, a fellow learned friend, an in-house lawyer, working for a law firm, for example, he or she shall, for the purpose of the National Pensions Act, Section 30B, subsection 1, as detailed in the regulations, if he or she earns remuneration exceeding 50,000 rupees in a month, for example, he or she shall, in respect of that month, pay CSG at the rate of 3% of that remuneration. And the employer or law firm shall, on his or her behalf, and in respect of that month, pay CSG at the rate of 6% of that remuneration. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, this situation is untenable and defies logic, because this is where the discrimination lies. Other main concerns about the CSG is that it will be an unfunded system as opposed to a funded system like the NPF. And we all know in an unfunded system, contributions from employers and employees will be used each year to pay for people who have already retired. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, instead also of those contributions being paid into individuals' accounts for the participants, as was the case under the NPF, government will now be collecting the contributions and same will be injected into the consolidated fund in order to finance the recurrent expenditure in terms of retirement pension. This was the argument of Honorable Utim rightly pointed out before this House. Thus, since the CSG is unfunded, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, its sustainability will invariably depend on whether the balance between the working population and the retired population is maintained. In fact, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, as I have mentioned in my speech during the debates on the Finance Miscellaneous Bill, which thereafter was enacted, CSG is a disguised tax and has been described as an unsustainable scheme and will operate more as a Ponzi-like structure. No studies or report elaborated by professionals in the sector have been undertaken to see to it whether the terms of fairness and the impact it will have on the cost of doing business in Mauritius will change for the better or for the worse. Unfortunately, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, as at date, no national consultation exercise were held in relation to such an important change in our pension schemes. In fact, even the NPF board, nor were its investment committee established under the NPA consulted prior to the decision taken to abolish the NPF and to introduce the CSG. And same applies to other bodies like the Actuarial Society of Mauritius, whose comments and recommendations were never even taken on board by the Honourable Minister. On this side of the House, we are utterly disappointed that despite the call for wider consultation from the Association of Actuaries, from Business Mauritius, from trade unions, and the civil society at large, the Honourable Minister went ahead with the regulations, and now we have an unprecedented situation whereby it is now in the hands of the judiciary. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, taking into account the doctrine of separation of powers, at this point in time, it shall be only just and reasonable that the applicability of the regulations in question be put in abeyance, at the very least, in view of what I have described earlier on with regard to the cases lodged before the Supreme Court. In the meantime, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I shall propose that a select committee of this House be set up to address the important issue of pension reforms. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, taking into account that there are cases before the Supreme Court and that our judiciary will give their ruling, their determination, their interpretation as to the constitutionality involved in this particular debate in this House and before the court, I shall move the House that the Contribution Sociale Généralisée Regulations 2020, laid on the table of the Assembly on the 3rd of November 2020, be disallowed, purely and simply. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir.